Here at the bottom of the hour, I'm Jake Wittenberg.
And I'm Mimi Jung. So here's what's coming up on King 5 Mornings.
So now that the vaccine is finally here, what comes next?
It's remarkable what King 5 in particular has done where I work. To think we could do it now with almost nobody in that newsroom, but it's still been really weird to show up and there's only there's no one there. There's no one there. There's like 4 or 5 of us there, which is mind-boggling, really, isn't it, when you think about the television industry?
I've watched King 5 all during the pandemic, and I think they've done a great job to adapt to a most unusual situation and to bring people the information they need every day. I admire them so much, and I think I look around my house and wonder, well, where would my studio have been? How would I have set this up? I think a lot of people don't realize too about television broadcasting, which at times looks, oh, that's an easy job. It's all they have to do is get up and talk to the camera and talk to their compadres. It's a lot, for people who are on the air on a daily basis, it's a lot easier being able to sit next to someone and to be able to interact and play off each other and know when they're supposed to talk and when you're supposed to talk, as opposed to Jake in the garage, Mimi in the studio, or Rich at home, or Joyce in the studio, Mark Wright in the newsroom. Right. It just doesn't, it still is done very well, but there's still a flow within the broadcast that there's a little bit missing from that.
You know, when we're looking back on this year of 2020 and all the impact of COVID-19, let's just try to put it in some sort of historical perspective. You know, we've both lived through some of the more traumatic things in American history. You were a bit older than me when some of these things happened. But so why don't I ask you the question, what do you remember about 1963 and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy?
That was, I think it was in 4th or 5th grade, and living in Virginia, just outside of DC. And it was Friday, if I recall properly. And we were told in school that the president was shot, and I think at the time they weren't sure if he was alive or dead. But we were let out of school early, and I went home. And I recall clearly my mother sitting on the couch right in front of the TV. And she was watching every bit of the coverage. And at that time, it had been determined that the president was dead. And she stayed in that position the whole day. As it got dark, she didn't move, she didn't turn on lights, just the reflective glow of the black and white TV off her face and the tears that she was shedding.
Your memories of that day are much more vivid than mine. It's interesting for me, we were living in Canada at the time in Moose Jaw, and I was, I guess, 4 or 5 years old or whatever, and I don't remember the day of the assassination very well, but boy, I sure remember the day of the funeral. That's the memory that just sort of seared on my brain, just how quiet the house was. And let's fast forward to 1968. What do you remember about the assassination of Martin Luther King? Because I have some memories of that myself. So what are yours?
Well, after King was killed, assassinated, the cities across the United States went up in flames. I mean, people rioted. And we lived 10, 15 miles from downtown Washington, D.C. But yet from our house, we could see the smoke rising from the devastation in town. And that night, it was either that night or the night after, James Brown, the soul singer, came on local television to urge the residents of the District of Columbia to settle down, to be peaceful. That's what I remember of that particular day.
For me, I was younger, and we lived in Bellevue, and my memories are going to be nothing like what you just said, but what I recall was my brother, who's older. I have a much older brother, Bob, and we just heard it over the radio, but oh my gosh, it seemed like the house stood still. Bob and I were glued to the radio. Then our dad came in the room, and he wondered what was going on, and so it's just sort of, general memories like that, but boy, it's still to this day. Like occasionally I even drive by that little house in Bellevue. It was a little rental home we had at the time in the Eastgate area of Bellevue. All right, taking a slight detour now. I'm outside in front of the house in which I lived in 1968. This is in Bellevue, Washington. This is the first house I ever lived in here in the United States. I was born in Canada. My parents moved us to England for a few years. Then we came to the United States, emigrated here in very early 1968. And like I mentioned, it was here that my brother Bob and I heard the news about Martin Luther King and his assassination in Memphis. Now, let's go back to Denny indoors. He's going to pick up our story with his dad's connection to history.
My father, who was an FBI agent, was involved in bringing James Earl Ray, the man who was accused and convicted of killing King, back into the United States after his capture overseas. And on a Saturday, my dad came up from downstairs. It was late in the afternoon, and he was kind of shaking, and he said, "They want to send me and George Zeiss, another agent, who was even a bigger man than my father, to London to pick up James Earl Ray to bring him back to the United States." So he packed his bags and went to Andrews Air Force Base and flew to London to pick up Ray. There was extradition problems at the time, so I think he spent 10 or 11 days being wined and dined by the folks at Scotland Yard. In the meantime, his father back in Missouri was ill, so he had to go back home. And when they finally worked out the extradition problems to bring Ray back to the United States, my dad went to Memphis and worked with the sheriff of Shelby County to meet the plane, escort Ray to the Shelby County jail. There's a famous picture of Ray being led through a doorway. He's handcuffed, he's manacled. One gentleman on his right, Ray's right, is I believe the Shelby County sheriff. The guy on the left was cut out of the picture for years, and that was my father. And when the records of Ray's assassination and his arrest and his trial, they were all made public years later. That picture was finally made public.
You know, that is such a moment in American history. Did your dad ever talk later about it? I mean, his place, I mean, he's, you know, in a small way has a place in history.
He did. You know, I was in high school at the time, and I guess I wasn't curious enough to ask him a lot about it. Newspapers would do feature articles as he got older, and I think he was on a couple of radio shows.
What was that like, having a father who was an FBI agent?
Didn't think too much about it. All I know is when he was an agent and we moved to Virginia from Illinois back in 1962, and he taught firearms at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia at the time. He eventually retired from the FBI, so he left the FBI and then got a job as the head of security at the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, which at the time had the bunker. The bunker was built underneath the Greenbrier Resort and was to be used exclusively by the United States government in the event of a nuclear emergency.
Really?
That's where the U.S. government would transfer to, from D.C. to White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. And my dad got the job as the head of security at the Greenbrier, and his friend Fritz Bugas said, "Ken, got to show you something."
Wow. That's an amazing story, just the bunker story.
The bunker story was made public. The Washington Post did an article in, I think, 1992. I think the bunker is now a casino.
Is that right? Trying to turn it into...
And I don't know where the U.S. government goes now in the event of a nuclear emergency.
Right.